I remember hearing all kinds of dire predictions about the decline of the domestic oil industry and the national security implications back in the 1980s when just 30% of our oil was being brought in from overseas. Most of those arguments were replayed when the portion of oil from imports passed 50%. And now the U.S. gets more than 60% of our oil supplies from other countries. So this situation didn't just occur overnight. In fact, it's the result of a conscious policy by 30 years of government, both Democrat and Republican administrations, to accept the benefits of relatively cheap oil rather than doing anything to reduce our dependence on hostile nations for the lifeblood of our economic prosperity. The real concern in allowing this to continue is that while importing so much oil, we're actually exporting dollars to countries that are sworn enemies of our country and want to destroy our way of life. By our addiction to foreign oil, we're actually helping to fund the very sources of terrorism that our military men and women are now engaged to fight. Fortunately, the single largest supplier of oil to the U.S. is our relatively friendly neighbor to the north. But two of the four biggest suppliers are Venezuela and Saudi Arabia. Clearly, Hugo Chavez in Venezuela is no friend of the U.S., and our oil dollars are funding his campaign of hate and anti-Americanism. The Saudi Arabians are usually considered to be our allies in the Middle East, but individual Saudis are contributing oil dollars to fund al-Qaeda and other terrorists. In the past, our federal government has opted for temporary, feel-good attempts to reduce the pain of high prices, but now we need a permanent solution to what is a permanent problem. We need a three-step solution to energy independence. We should immediately encourage production of domestic oil reserves in the U.S. and do all we can to help facilitate the flow of Canadian oil to this country in safe and environmentally sound methods. South Dakota can benefit from this policy directly because we are on the road between those Canadian oil reserves and the big markets in the Midwest and the eastern United States. This policy will help us through the next 20 years until we find ways to move away from dependence on hydrocarbons altogether. Secondly, we should adopt a long-term policy of increased renewable energy sources, such as South Dakota's own ethanol, biodiesel, and wind power resources, but also including development of nuclear power. From the combination of those sources, the U.S. can greatly reduce the amount of oil and natural gas used to generate electricity and the resulting production of CO2. We have the technology to supply all the electrical power the United States needs from wind, solar, and nuclear sources. We just need a sensible federal policy and transmission system to make it happen. Most importantly, and most dramatically though, we need a new energy source as the basis for our 21st century economy. We need to get off our hydrocarbon addiction and onto a new source that'll propel America into the new century and keep our country at the forefront of economic leadership. To do this, we need the equivalent to President Kennedy's moonshot challenge of the 1960s. Instead of "we'll put a man on the moon by the end of the decade," we need a national commitment to find the technology and innovations that will reduce our oil imports by 50% by 2020. But in order to avoid the old big government traps, we need to do this in the private sector, with the federal government acting as a facilitator. By offering prizes for innovation and entrepreneurial breakthroughs, the federal government can be the catalyst to direct America's brain power where it is needed and where it can generate the greatest benefits. Everyone acknowledges that one day the oil will run out. The only question is when. We can either keep our heads in the sand and be the victims of that day, or embrace the change necessary to drive that change and benefit from the new technologies that will define the new economy. That's what American leadership has always been about, and that's how America has always been at the top of the world's economies in the last century. Only by making America the leader of that change can we maintain our position in the international economy and ensure the prosperity for all Americans in the new energy for the 21st century.